I would like to acknowledge the elders, families, and descendants of the indigenous people who have been custodians of the lands on which we are meeting today for many generations. And obviously, everyone would be meeting with us on a very different, in a very different location. But I am acknowledging the first people of Hobson's Bay, Yalukit Wilum, where I am currently located. So today we gathered to bring together AIPA members and friends to again face or try to break through those challenges of not being able to see each other because of the COVID pandemic, and start maybe online, more online engagement between AIPA members. And Janek, as always, has been very generous with his time to prepare and read and share those, readings and analysis that he's been going through with us on the COVID-19 pandemic, and provide some comparisons as well about the approach taken by Australia and the approach taken by Poland. And then it would be fantastic if we engage in a kind of, discussion and questions and have this AIPA spirit, renewed. And hopefully this will be the first online meeting of AIPA this year, and we will continue to have those meetings more often. So over to you, Janek. Take a floor, and then afterwards, let's have a discussion.
Thank you very much, Gosia, and very warm welcome to everyone who decided to devote the afternoon to listening and discussion about pandemics. It's a crucial topic, so I expect that everyone has some views on that, and I would like to stress that I would like to share views rather than present to you any well thought through and researched statement about pandemia. It's my hobby, so to speak, but related to sociological analysis of societies and social change. And I think the current pandemic is a very important factor in changing the direction and shape of social change. I will pick up at the point where I left in my recording for AIPA. Only in one or two sentences summarize the main points in this recording and focus on the major obstacles that emerge in the current stage of combating the pandemic. These two major obstacles, in my view, obstacles which we can overcome, the challenges which we can successfully face, are, on the one hand, a series of mistakes, errors, missteps in combating, which produces inevitably political backlash, declining trust in government, and therefore encouragement for social disorder and further mistakes. So the vicious circle of errors and backlashes which weaken the way in which government can face and suppress pandemics. The second obstacle, equally important, is a spread of anti-pandemic measure or anti-restriction views, including anti-vaccination views. The so-called vax deniers, as well as critics of restrictions. And it's not identical with the paranoid views of certain anti-scientific groups. It's a more complex picture, and it results in minorities of people in the developed countries now declaring that they will accept vaccination. So it's a big problem. Both are social problems, and I'll try to look at those problems from the sociological perspective, but in this case, it's a popular perspective too, so I'm not introducing any new specific sociological concepts. So the story so far. We looked at pandemics together during the previous presentation with the reflection that we were warned that it is coming. Already in September last year, the WHO and the World Bank issued a report titled "We Were Warned" or "World at Risk." And you can look at the copy of this report. It mentions quite clearly that both the type of ecological damage caused by our changing attitudes to animal and nature and globalization processes which link us together and create a network of interaction facilitating spread creates a situation whereby the issue of pandemics is not the whether issue, but when. And the report warns that there is a need for national strategies to combat pandemics, and warns also that such strategies can be derailed due to poor leadership. And indeed, it was a prophetic warning. And unfortunately, we are experiencing what the report predicted, failure of leadership and the resulting unnecessary loss of life, upending of economies, and growing social chaos. However, number of countries and number of leaders stood to the challenge. And we have also examples of very good management of pandemics, if we might call it that way, as well as some possible templates for combating it and some possible solutions, which I'll discuss. The first stage of pandemic, to remind, occurred when we faced a sudden spread, most probably from China, a virus which most probably jumped species and started to spread due to intense interaction, globalization, travel, mobility everywhere. And the first stage consisted of cutting the source of those infections in the form of travel restrictions and flattening the curve on infections, not to allow it to overcome the health systems, especially hospitals. And we concluded the recording, the last lecture, by saying that this most effective strategy of dealing with pandemics, COVID-19 pandemics, was, we shortened it to the 4T strategy: to maintain transparency and at the same time good timing, not to delay measures anti-COVID, to introduce fast and reliable testing, as many tests as possible, to have a system of tracking the major infections, their sources, their clusters, and applying treatment, specialized treatment in hospital, which prevents viral overload and makes the symptoms of illness much milder than in the case of neglected disease. And there was huge variation, of course, between different countries in the success of this strategy, which we propose to measure by victims, by deaths relative to population, number of COVID-caused deaths per million. And this measure remains probably the most reliable measure. The number of infections is not a very good measure because, as it was pointed out, it reflects the intensity of testing rather than the intensity of spread of the disease. Deaths have also some problems as a measure, as an indicator of effects of COVID. Nevertheless, the variation in the way medics and health system classify deaths is not very big. And as a recent study of excess deaths in about 150 countries conducted by Oxford University indicates, the error in measurements of deaths, usually underestimation of death, is quite similar in different countries. So it is a good indicator, not necessarily good measure, but a reliable indicator. May I add in parentheses that this study of excess death, that is deaths during the period of pandemia, which were above death rates last year without pandemia, varies between 50%, those are smallest underestimates, or 40%, smallest underestimates, to about 250%. Most dramatic underestimates were unfortunately in Britain, some Asian countries, and South America, especially in big cities. There, the excess deaths were at least twice the number of cases reported to WHO as a result of COVID infections. So how does the situation look at present? Infections are particularly high in high density population, that is in societies which have large number of population on small territories and which have high mobility of those populations. So places, unfortunately, such as India, like Mexico, Peru, face a big problem because there you've got a combination of not only high density and mobility due to the nature of employment of people, but also very limited resources they have. On the other hand, we've got curious cases, countries like Belgium and Sweden. I'll talk about both. In Belgium, we've got monumental, it's one of the highest in the world rates of death, especially around Brussels. It's about 900 deaths per million population. Partly, it might be due to the fact that Belgium has very high proportion of elderly people, most vulnerable to death, in clusters of nursing homes. Luxembourg and Belgium have the highest proportion. About over 90% of elderly spend the last years of their life in nursing home. And when nursing homes are invaded by the virus, you know what happens, because it did happen in Victoria. Countries with largest number of deaths, like USA with over 180,000, Brazil 120,000, Mexico 60,000, India 60,000, although in India this morning they reported that there was nearly 80,000 new infections in the last 24 hours and over 1,000 deaths. So India will be climbing, unfortunately, up the list of countries with highest death rates. And in terms of deaths per million, we've got Belgium and Peru, about 900 deaths per million. Then we've got European countries like UK, Spain, Italy, Chile, Sweden, and outside Europe, Brazil, with around about 600 deaths per million. And USA, Mexico, France, with about 500 deaths per million. Just as a comparison, Australia has about 22 deaths per million, in spite of the dramatic increase over the last 2 weeks due to the infection of number of nursing homes. Poland has about 52, but all my friends who work in this area in Poland tell me to multiply it at least by 2 to have the real numbers, so about 100. And also countries like Israel and Russia have about 100, plus minus 20, 30. Sweden is another country I wanted to mention because it has been given incorrectly as an example of a very different and quite effective strategy of dealing with coronavirus. It's not the case at all. Swedes decided not to accept and introduce lockdowns and go for minimum disruption in normal daily routines. The result was a very rapid increase in infections, but above all, enormous growth of deaths, mostly of people in nursing homes and mostly of people who were migrants. Sweden has a very high proportion of immigrants. Nearly over a quarter of Swedish populations are immigrants, and information about management of virus did not penetrate many suburbs where such migrants lived. So Swedish strategy of non-disruption, normal life, is very expensive. Over 600 deaths per million, which is more than 20 times the Australian rate, is unacceptable. But it is very strongly supported by young people in Sweden. And this is something about which we'll talk a bit more later, that the measures introduced by different countries, different strategies of dealing with coronavirus, especially at this now second stage, where the game is called containment and eradication, rather than merely control, divided almost all populations into those who support very stringent isolation measures, lockdown, communication restrictions, closing schools, etc. And such measures are very strongly supported, obviously, by older people who are most vulnerable to death. To remind you, in parentheses, that there is enormous difference in death rates, in risk of death, between different age groups. Those below 30, although they are increasingly now infected by virus in all developed countries, do not run very high risks. As you know, if you divide the current number of infected, 24 million, by the current world number of deaths, which is 825,000, The death rate is less than 1/3 of 1%. But it varies from almost 0 in younger groups to about 9% in the oldest age groups, people over 75. So older people are more ready to accept stringent measures which increase their security. And they are usually much more affluent than younger people, especially in countries like Australia, when we've got very wealthy old generation of baby boomers due to the success of superannuation measures. And young people who are mostly concerned about making living. And lockdowns are extremely economically disruptive and expensive. Even countries which introduce, like in Australia, various measures to support, increase support for young and exposed, especially in the service sector, cannot quell the unease with which young generations accept the lockdown level measures as something which privileges the older and vulnerable against the interests of the younger people. We have to understand that. We might not accept it, but we have to understand the difference of perspective, because this difference of perspective might cause a serious social disruption. Okay? If there is a social division and conflict about the measures which should be accepted in combating virus, effectiveness of the measures will be seriously compromised, if not eliminated. So this is the point where we come now to the current stage. I can talk more about the data on deaths, but the variation, you had a taste of variation, and an important point that Australia is among the most successful countries dealing with the virus, as measured by number of deaths per million. And had there not been this breaking of the virus to a number of nursing homes and the resulting carnage over the last 2 weeks, Australia would be in the company of the most successful countries, which have less than 5 deaths per million. But it was unfortunately a big failure, which tells you that if it happens even in 2 or 3 nursing homes, the cost of it in terms of human life is enormous. Those who say, oh yeah, but these are people who are in the 80s, 90s, and 100s who are dying of COVID. Oh, but hang on, the profile of people dying from COVID is not very different than the profile of Nobel Prize winners, as I pointed out to the Swedish social scientists who were saying, oh, don't worry, here in Sweden only very old people who would have died anyway. Yeah, it's a big social cost. We cannot ignore it. And the arguments that if the old die only, we should not worry, do not wash. So we have to look at those figures and remember that, like with terrorism, it's easy to make even one small mistake. The consequences of it are enormous and fatal. Therefore, the strategy of dealing with the virus, combating it, is so difficult. It requires almost perfect success. Even one small failure might cause enormous problems, as we know in not only in Victoria, in New South Wales, Ruby Princess debacle. Terrible, terrible. Probably about 30, 40 deaths in Australia out of a few hundred in New South Wales is due to this debacle. Allowing health workers and families to bring virus to nursing homes. Again, the argument of the Prime Minister that it happened only in 3% of nursing homes. Yeah, it's enough to cause a massive, massive death toll. And the problem with spread in youth detention center places where you've got a large number of people in small area. Problems with housing, the Housing Commission floods in Victoria are so dense. It's a danger. It's a disaster in waiting. Therefore, in a sense, pandemia opens our eyes for risks and threats. And I'm very impressed by the way in which Australian government, state and federal, immediately introduce, after each failure, after each cock-up, they start the inquiry, public inquiry, to learn from the mistakes. We should do that. This is the best way of dealing with pandemic. Learning very quickly and making strategies flexible depending on the findings. Where did we go wrong? And how to prevent going wrong in the future, introducing the lessons of it immediately. And finally, we are facing big problems now, which we are more and more aware. We're not aware of these problems earlier. As I said, first, it's a problem that if you make a mistake, try to cover up and repeat these mistakes, you create disaster. Because not only you create more victims, you open the way for higher toll, but also you delegitimize, you decrease trust in government. Most of these measures are governmental measures. So you decrease trust in government. Therefore, the future measures of government will be less effective because of lower trust, lower legitimacy, backlash, opposition, etc. So it's important to have such public inquiries as a way of diffusing skepticism. And unfortunately, in most of other countries than Australia, there is no such mechanism. And Poland is a good example. A number of errors were made, terrible errors. Yet there was no public inquiry because the issue of pandemic was never allowed to be bipartisan. And it was used by government. All the errors were buried by government. They were not discussed. The effects were obvious for the public, and trust in government declined, and therefore it opens the way for big backlash. It's much stronger backlash in Poland than in Australia. I'll briefly talk about it, especially on both extremes of political spectrum, among especially radical right, Confederacja, which now nurses mass movements, about well over 100,000 people who participate in the activities of numerous skeptical organizations which oppose any tough measures and restrictions against the virus. Very difficult to combat because partly they're also political allies of the ruling party. By contrast, the opposition criticized those mistakes because they were not given an opportunity to take responsibilities for these mistakes by being included in the negotiation and planning of those strategies. So Poland illustrates a massive failure of achieving bipartisan policies, and only bipartisan policies, and policies which are international in their scope, which accept that Poland is not an island, and a certain amount of migration always occurs. Therefore, if you want to combat it, you have to enter some sort of European or regional coalition. Neither of that happened in Poland, and therefore the results are so pitiful compared to Australia. Poland is not doing too badly, but I suspect that statement has to be qualified. We don't know how many victims of COVID is in Poland, and all my colleagues from Collegium Civitas who are interested in the topic warn me that I should double the estimates to be closer to the reality. Second problem. It's much more difficult problem because it's a problem of misinformation and the spread of particular beliefs that are anti-scientific, which are soaked in conspiracy theories, and which reflect not only the normal reduced trust in government measures, but also religious beliefs, extreme political beliefs, ideological beliefs, and the impact of misinformation, which come with what we might now call informational war. Whether we want or not, most of the developed countries enter a period of cyber confrontation. And the issue of pandemia has been drawn into this information war. So I'll talk very briefly about this strange belief systems, which might paralyze our struggle with pandemia, and leave it to the discussion. Probably all of you are familiar with the sort of strange, quasi-sectarian, quasi-cultic conspiracy movement formed in around 2015-17 called QAnon. It was originally triggered by a misinformation or piece of gossip around unfounded claim that President Trump enters as an agent of breaking massive conspiracy run supposedly by the Clinton family and the deep state uncontrolled part of administration, aiming at supporting pedophile rings in government. Of course, that was only the starting point. QAnon very quickly branched into all sorts of irrational, unfounded conspiracies. So very soon, Bill Gates was nominated by QAnon as an agent of government control, which uses vaccinations, especially against COVID, to inject people with chips which would allow him to control the world. It was joined very soon by 5G conspiracy, whereby the world's surveillance would be extended and freedom would be killed using the 5G network. You've probably seen the slogans, where we go one, we go all, which is a favorite slogan of QAnon movement. And it lives only in the Facebook through trolls and websites. And in spite of the attempts of Facebook and Twitter to erase those QAnon conspiracy beliefs, it's very difficult to deal with them. And they, like as mushrooms, as they say in the wet weather in Poland, and you've got all sorts of conspiracy. I hesitate to call them theories. They have no empirical support, but they are conspiracy beliefs with some elements there which sound true. So Save the Children ads, global bankers cabal with very strong anti-Semitic element in it, that the measures against COVID are used by the Jewish bankers like Soros to gain control over the world. Websites such as 4chan and 8chan also have racist elements added to those conspiracy beliefs. It is okay to be white, for example, campaign in Australia, conducted mostly by the far-right groups like One Nation, has many references to struggle with COVID used as a screen to achieve control. So in Poland, you've got very similar phenomena. Poland is affected by protests against big pharmas, which use vaccination in order to subdue population, inject control chips, or to poison children. Lockdowns used in order to eliminate private activities and freedom, and protests against pandemic. This is a term used by especially Father Rydzyk in Radio Maria, as well as Polish exponents of those views who are mostly from Confederation, but also from religious groups and anti-vaxxers. Who belongs to those groups? If you ask such question about half a year before, I would say this is a typical social location of such exotic views. Personal grievances, extreme ideology, anti-science, low education, etc., etc. But it's much worse now, because these QAnon type of groups, conspiracy views, which are very strongly against the measures against COVID, were joined by more rational groups in which you find many highly educated people. These are groups which oppose the competition to bring vaccination as quickly as possible, regardless of its safety. They have strong, rational arguments behind them that big pharmaceutical companies, which are encouraged in America and in Australia by government by huge amount of money to produce vaccines as quickly as possible, even if it's not fully tested against possible side effects. You might know the American program, I forgot its name, where billions of dollars were given to pharmaceutical companies to bring it as quickly as possible, even if full body of tests required by WHO for registrations is not done. And you've got stop vaccination companies, the associations, or the Mercury Project, the World Mercury Project, which are run by Robert Kennedy Jr., the son of Robert F. Kennedy. So many American elite members, educated people, who are very rational in their thinking, now join anti-vaxxers, or we should call them probably skeptics, vaccination skeptics, And the opposition is so strong that the current numbers of public opinion in America and probably also in Australia indicates that only minority of people would accept vaccination if given a choice in Australia. So enormous task cut for government and indication that when the strategy, when the battle against pandemic is left only in the hands of governments, but it ignores civil society, organizations like community groups, like NGOs, which can be very helpful in this strategy. If it's limited to government interventions, it might encounter big obstacles. And I'm seriously worried that even if we have a vaccination, even if this vaccination is effective, safe, and cheap, it might be a long battle before it gives its beneficial effects and allows us to return to some aspects of global traveling and contacts. Thank you.
Thank you, Janku, so much for your presentation. I will